Odessa Vance had $4 and a cracked coffee pot to her name, and she spent the last of it on a stranger. He came to her door at dusk with his hat in his hands. A young man, thin as a fence rail, cheeks burned raw by the sun and the wind. He didn't beg. He just stood there on the worn step and looked at her, and his eyes did the asking his mouth was too proud to do. She didn't ask his name. She set a full plate down in front of him. Beans, and a wedge of cornbread, and a strip of salt pork she'd been saving for herself. Then she poured him coffee from the blue enamel pot, and she took nothing from him. Not a coin, not a chore, not even a thank you, though he gave her one anyway. She didn't apologize for being poor. And she didn't ask his name. The town saw it. The town always saw it. Prudence Galt stood on the porch of her husband's store, with her arms folded across her chest, and she said it loud enough for the street to hear. Feeding tramps with money she owes the bank. Soft in the head. That one. 40 wagons rolled past Coldwater Crossing that summer. 40 wagons, and Odessa Vance had turned away not a single hungry man among them. The drifter rode north the next morning. And he told it. He told it at every fire on the trail, to every man who'd share the light. By the time the notice went up on her door, word was already moving up the western trail faster than any bank could ride. If you believe kindness never goes unnoticed, this story is for you. Before we ride any farther, do this one thing. Subscribe, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story rides. Now settle in, because it starts small, the way these things always do. It starts at Coldwater Crossing, in the Texas Panhandle, in the year 1879. You could ride 2 days in any direction from that place, and not find another table set for a stranger. That was the thing about the crossing. It sat where the western trail met the shallow bend of the Coldwater, where the herds came down to drink before the long dry push north. 10,000 head of cattle churned through that water in a season. 10,000 head, and the tired men who drove them, and every one of those men had to eat. Most of them ate whatever they carried, hardtack gone to weevils, beans scorched black over a chuck wagon fire, coffee thick enough to float a horseshoe. But some of them ate at Odessa's table. It wasn't a fine place. It never pretended to be. A low plank building with a sod roof and a stone chimney, set back from the ford where the dust didn't reach so bad. Inside there was one long table Amos had built with his own 2 hands, sanded smooth by 20 years of elbows. There was a black iron stove that ate cottonwood and mesquite. And there was the coffee pot. The blue enamel one, chipped along the spout, with a hairline crack up one side that she'd sealed with a paste of flour and water more times than she could count. It sat on the back of that stove morning to night, and it was always warm. That was the rule of the place. The pot was always warm. Over the door hung a plank of bur oak. Amos had carved it himself, one long winter, letter by letter, with a knife gone dull. The words were crooked. The V leaned, but you could read them plain enough in any light. No man rides hungry from this door. Amos Vance had lived by those words for 26 years, and Odessa had lived by them beside him, and when he died, she kept living by them because they were the only piece of him she had left that still spoke. He'd died 2 winters back. It was a young horse that did it, a green colt somebody had left in his care to gentle. The colt spooked at nothing. At a shadow, at a bird coming up out of the grass. It kicked out with both hind legs and caught Amos in the chest, and he went down in the corral mud, and he never got all the way up again. Not really. The doctor came from Tascosa, 40 miles, and charged what a doctor charges when he knows you've got no choice. Amos lasted 11 days. He talked near the end. He held her hand with fingers that had gone soft and cold, and he made her promise. "Keep the door open, Des," he said. "Whatever comes. A man that rides in hungry, you feed him. Don't you ever weigh a hungry man against $1. You'll lose that trade every time and be poorer for winning it. She promised. Of course she promised. You don't argue with a dying man about the one thing he believes in. So she kept the door open. But the doctor's fee had to be paid. And it was a bad year for cattle, the year Amos died, a hard winter that killed the market and a dry spring that killed the grass. The little money they'd put by went to the ground with him, into the doctor's pocket and the undertaker's and the taxman's. And when it was all gone and there was still more owing, Odessa Vance did the thing she'd sworn to Amos she'd never have to. She went into town, into the fine brick building on the corner with the gold letters on the glass, and she signed her name to a note. $615 at the Drover's Trust Bank, with the land itself put up against it. The house, the corral, the good spring that never went dry even in August, and a quarter-mile of river frontage along the Coldwater. $615. To a woman who fed men for free, it might as well have been the moon. That was 2 years back. She'd paid what she could, when she could, a few dollars at the end of a good month, but the good months were thin. She had $4 and some change in a tobacco tin under the loose floorboard by the stove, and she had a stove full of somebody else's supper, and she had that carved plank over the door telling her every single day exactly who she was supposed to be. The morning after she fed the young drifter, an old drover stopped at her table for coffee. He was gray as a badger and bent like a question mark, and he'd been up and down that trail so many times he knew the name of every crossing between the Nueces and the Cimarron. He drank 2 cups standing up. When he set the cup down, he touched the brim of his hat to her, courtly as a Sunday preacher. "Obliged, ma'am," he said. Then he looked at the pot on the stove, and something crossed his weathered face, a kind of private amusement. "You know, Roark still tells about your beans." Odessa was wiping down the plank. She didn't look up. "Roark," she said. "You don't remember." The old man chuckled, low. "No, I don't expect you would. You've fed half the trail, and a body can't remember every mouth." He fished a coin from his vest and laid it by his cup, though she hadn't charged him. "Well, he remembers. That's all I'll say." He went out into the morning and swung up onto his horse and rode north after the herd, and Odessa stood there a moment with the rag in her hand, and then she shook her head and went back to her work. Roark, she'd fed 1,000 men. Maybe 10,000. Names ran through that door like water through the ford. You couldn't hold them. You didn't try. You just kept the pot warm and the door open, and you let them go on down the trail to wherever the trail took them. It was a fine thing to say that some man told stories about her cooking. It warmed a body for about as long as the coffee did. But it wasn't money, and money was the thing she was running short of. She learned just how short 4 days later. She was out at the woodpile in the cool of the morning, splitting mesquite, when she heard the horse. It came at a walk, unhurried, and that was the first thing that pricked her. Trailmen came in tired and dusty and in a hurry to eat. This rider came slow, the way a man rides when he owns the road under him and wants you to notice. Silas Thorne sat a tall bay gelding with silver on the bridle. He wore a black coat too heavy for the season and a white shirt with never a speck of trail dust on it, and he had the smooth pink hands of a man who had never in his life split his own wood. He drew rein a polite distance from her and touched his hat, and he smiled. It was a good smile. That was the terrible thing about it. It was a warm, easy banker's smile, and behind it his eyes were doing sums. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "A fine morning." "Mr. Thorne?" She set the axe head down against the block and straightened her back and wiped her hands on her apron. She knew who he was. Everybody at the crossing knew Silas Thorne, president of the Drover's Trust, and something more than that, though nobody could ever say quite what. A man who bought land quiet and sold it loud. A man who always seemed to know, a year ahead of everyone else, where the money was going to be. "I won't keep you from your work," he said, still smiling, and made no move to leave. I was passing on my way to look at some property, and I thought, well, neighborly to stop. See how the widow Vance is keeping. I'm keeping. So I see. So I see. His gaze drifted past her. It touched the house and the corral, and then it went where she'd known it would go all along. To the spring. The good cold spring that bubbled up clear from the rocks behind the house and ran down in a bright thread to join the river. In a country where water was the difference between life and dust, Odessa's spring had never once failed. His eyes rested on it a long moment. Then, they came back to her, warm as ever. "I'll be plain with you, ma'am, because I respect you too much to be otherwise," he said. "The note's come due. The full note. $615. The morning went very quiet. Even the birds seemed to hush. I've been paying it down," she said, "a little at a time." That was the understanding. The understanding. He said the word gently, the way you'd handle something already broken. There was no understanding written into the paper, Mrs. Vance. There was a note, and a term, and the term is up. The bank has been more than patient. But a bank can't run on patience. It runs on payment. He sighed, and it sounded almost real. The last of the herds will clear this crossing in about 19 days. I'd want the matter settled by then. $615, in full, or the bank will have to take the property in satisfaction of the debt. That's the law. It gives me no pleasure. 19 days. She might make $19 in 19 days if every one of them was a good day and the herds ran heavy and the men had coin to spare. She would not make 615. She would not make it in 19 days, or 90, or 900. And they both knew it. He knew it better than she did. He'd known it before he ever rode out. That was the piece that didn't fit, and even standing there gut-punched, she felt the wrongness of it. A man like Silas Thorne did not ride 4 miles out of his way over a $600 note. He had clerks for that. He had a man in a paper collar who nailed up notices and never got his boots dirty. But here was the president himself, in his good black coat, come to tell a poor widow she was ruined, and smiling while he did it, and looking the whole time, not at her, and not at her books, but at her water. She didn't understand it yet. But she felt it, the way you feel weather coming before you see the cloud. 19 days, she said. 19 days. He gathered his reins. The bay tossed its fine head. "I truly am sorry, ma'am. A woman shouldn't have to carry a man's debts alone." He touched his hat once more. "You feed a lot of hungry men, I hear. Admirable, truly, but a man can't eat admiration, and neither can a bank." He turned the horse. 19 days, Mrs. Vance. I hope you'll have found a way." He rode off slow, the way he'd come. She watched him go until the dust settled, and then she picked up the axe again, because there was wood to split, and supper to make, and men would be coming down to the ford hungry, whether or not Silas Thorne meant to take her home. Her hands shook on the handle. She made them stop. 19 days. She didn't tell anyone. Who was there to tell? She set another log on the block, and she split it clean, and the sound of it rang out across the quiet yard, and behind her the blue pot ticked and steamed on the stove, always warm, waiting for whoever came next. Whoever came next came 6 days later, and half the town came with him. It was a big day at the ford. 2 herds had backed up at the crossing, 3,000 head between them, and the water was churned to chocolate, and the air was full of dust and bawling. Freight wagons waited their turn on the near bank, a whole line of them, teamsters standing in the shade of their loads. Some of the town had wandered out to watch the spectacle, because a big crossing was the closest thing to a show the crossing ever got. Prudence Galt was there, in her good bonnet, holding court by the store wagon. Her husband was there, the blacksmith, a knot of children throwing rocks in the shallows. And into all of that, rode a thin man on a spent horse. He was a drover, though not a young one. He rode hunched, one arm wrapped across his belly, and even from a distance you could see he was wrong. His face was the gray-green of river mud. Sweat stood out on him, though the day wasn't yet hot. Some sickness had him, the kind that runs through a trail outfit and lays men out one after another, and his outfit had pushed on without him. The way outfits do, because a herd waits for no man's fever. He'd fallen behind. He'd been riding on nothing but the horse's will, and his own for a day and a night, and when he saw the sod house set back from the ford, and the smoke from the chimney, he turned toward it the way a dying plant turns toward light. He didn't make it to the door on his own. He got down off the horse, and his legs folded, and he sat down hard in the dirt of her yard. And Odessa, who had been watching for exactly this the way she watched for it every day of her life, came out with a tin cup already in her hand. At that same moment, a wagon rolled up from town. It came fast, and it came with purpose, and the man driving it wore a paper collar and a sour town face, and beside him on the seat was a hammer and a fistful of iron nails and a single folded sheet of paper. He was Thorne's man. He drew up in front of the house, in front of the whole watching crossing, and he climbed down, and he did not so much as glance at the sick man sitting in the dirt. He walked to Odessa's door. To the door under Amos's carved plank, and he took a nail from his fist, and he set the folded paper against the wood, and he raised the hammer. The first blow rang out across the ford like a shot. Everybody heard it. The teamsters looked up. Prudence Galt turned. The children stopped throwing rocks. The word at the top of that paper was printed big and black, so it could be read from a distance, and the word was notice. And the words under it, smaller, said what everybody standing there already understood: foreclosure, public sale. The property of the widow Vance, to satisfy a debt to the drover's trust bank. The hammer came down again. And again. Each blow drove the iron deeper into the oak, right there beneath the crooked carved words about no man riding hungry. And Odessa Vance did not stop. She was already kneeling in the dirt beside the sick drover. She had his hat off and his head tipped back against her arm. She held the tin cup to his cracked lips, and it wasn't water. It was broth, thick and warm, dipped fresh from the pot she'd had going since dawn. She fed it to him a swallow at a time. She murmured to him low, the things you say to a frightened animal or a frightened child, that he was all right now, that he'd reached a place that would hold him, that nobody here was going to let him lie in the dirt. The hammer rang out behind her, and she did not turn her head. She had a man to feed. Everything else was noise. The town watched the whole of it. The nailing of the notice and the feeding of the drover, both at once. The two things happening in the same frame like a picture somebody had painted on purpose. The banker's man hammering ruin onto her door, and the ruined woman on her knees in the dirt, giving away the last of her broth to a stranger who couldn't pay her a dime and might not live till morning to try. Prudence Galt took it in from beside the store wagon. She saw the notice. She saw the broth. She saw the whole foolish shape of it, and she wanted the street to see it the way she saw it, and so she said it. Loud. Loud enough to carry over the water and the cattle and the ring of the hammer. Look at her. Look. Soft-headed to the last. She shook her head, and her bonnet ribbons trembled with the certainty of it. The bank's taking the roof off her head this very minute, and there she sits feeding a tramp. Some folks won't be helped. Some folks were born to lose. A few of the town laughed. Not all, but a few. And the laugh went out across the yard and reached Odessa where she knelt, and she heard it. She surely heard it, and still she did not lift her head. She dipped the cup again. She held it to the sick man's lips. His throat worked, and he swallowed, and he looked up at her with eyes full of a thing too big to say, and she said, "There now. There. That's the way. A little more. The banker's man drove the last nail and stepped back and looked at his work. He gathered his hammer. He climbed onto his wagon and clucked to his team and rolled away toward town, and he never once looked at the woman in the dirt, because she was already, to the ledger he served, a matter closed. The herds finished crossing. The dust settled. The town drifted back to its business, carrying the story with it to chew on over supper. And Odessa got the sick drover up, an arm around him, staggering under his weight, and she walked him inside and laid him on the cot by the warm stove, and she sat with him through the worst of the fever, and she did not read the notice on her door until the sun was long down and the man was asleep and breathing easy. She read it by lamplight, standing on her own step in the dark. Public sale. 19 days, and now 13. Her name and the bank's name and the cold, flat language of the law that took no account at all of a carved plank or a warm pot or a promise made to a dying man. She stood there a while. Then she folded the notice back the way it had been, and she left it nailed where it was, because taking it down wouldn't change a word of it. And she went inside to check on the sleeping man and bank the stove for the night. The next 13 days taught her exactly how alone a person can be with a debt. She tried. Nobody could ever say she didn't try. She went into town the morning after the notice went up, and she went to the general store because the Galts had carried her on credit before, small sums, seed and salt and coffee against the next good month. She stood at the counter with her chin up and asked for $30 worth of goods on account, meaning to lay in enough to feed the herds heavy through the last of the season and turn what coin she could. Prudence Galt was behind the counter. She let Odessa finish asking. Then she smiled, thin as a knife. "Credit," she said. "For a woman the bank's already foreclosed on." She made a little sound through her nose. "I'm sorry, Odessa, truly, but you understand our position. We can't be extending credit to somebody with a public notice on her door. Why, we'd never see a cent of it. Cash on the barrel, from here on. Same as anybody who can't be trusted to pay." The store had other people in it. They all heard. That was the point of saying it that way, and Odessa knew it, and she took it standing straight, and she counted out coins from her tobacco tin for a small sack of flour and a twist of salt, because she'd walked 4 miles and she wasn't going home empty. She laid the coins down one at a time on the worn counter, and Prudence Galt watched every one of them land. And neither woman said another word. She went to the bank, too. She went to the fine brick building with the gold letters, and she asked to see Mr. Thorne, and Mr. Thorne was not in. Mr. Thorne was away on business. But a clerk in a paper collar heard her out. She had $31. She had put every coin she owned on the counter. All of it, the tobacco tins scraped bare. $31 against $615. Could the bank take it, she asked, against the debt, as a payment in good faith to show she meant to keep trying? The clerk looked at the little pile of coins as if it were something the cat had brought in. "The note's called in full, ma'am," he said. "It's past the time for partial payments. Bank policy. We can't accept a portion against a foreclosed note. It's full satisfaction or it's the sale. I'm sorry." He pushed the coins back across the counter toward her. "You'd do better to keep it. You'll need to eat." So she scooped the $31 back into the tin, and she walked the 4 miles home, and she understood then, all the way down, that there was no ladder out of this hole. She'd known it since the morning at the woodpile. But knowing a thing and feeling it in your legs on a 4-mile walk home are two different kinds of knowing, and still, the men kept coming down to the ford. And still, she fed them. That was the part the town couldn't understand, and the part Odessa never once questioned. The notice was on her door, and her credit was cut, and her tin was near empty, and a trail cook came through, A black man driving a battered chuck wagon, hungry and short of supplies because the outfit he'd hired onto had let him go at Tascosa and told him to make his own way, on account of some men wouldn't eat food cooked by his hands. He'd been 3 days on little more than coffee. He didn't ask her for anything. He asked was there a store nearby would sell to him, because more than one wouldn't. Odessa sat him down at the plank table and fed him a plate of beans and pork and cornbread, and she filled a sack from her own thin stores to see him up the trail. And when he tried to pay, she said the same thing she said to all of them. "No man rides hungry from this door. That's not my rule. That's the rule of the house. You take it up with the man that carved it, and he's been dead 2 years, so you'll get no argument out of him." The cook laughed at that, surprised into it, and the laugh loosened something in his hard-traveled face. He ate. He rested. He went on north with a full belly and a full sack, and Odessa Vance was 1 plate poorer and did not count the cost, because she never counted the cost, because counting the cost was the one thing Amos had made her swear she'd never do. A widowed family came through, too, in those 13 days. A wagon with a cracked axle, and a mother with 3 children, and a look on her face like the bottom had already fallen out of the world once, and she was waiting for it to do it again. Her man had died on the trail south of the Canadian, of a snake bite, and she was trying to get the children through to her people in Kansas with almost nothing, and the axle had done for her not 200 yards from the ford. Odessa fed all 4 of them for 2 days while the blacksmith, shamed into decency by the widow's plain need, mended the axle for the cost of the iron and no more. 2 days of meals. 2 days of the pot going, and the stove hot, and the plank table crowded with children who ate like they'd forgotten food could come warm. When the wagon rolled out, patched and provisioned, the mother took Odessa's hands in both of hers and couldn't get a single word out past what was in her throat, and Odessa said, I know. Go on now. Get your babies to Kansas, and when you get there, you feed somebody hungry, and that's how you pay me. That's the only coin I take." The town watched all of it and shook its head. Prudence Galt had a fresh word for it every day, feeding the world with her landlord's roof over her head. Some folks won't be saved. The widow Vance, throwing good broth after bad debt. But there was a ledger the town couldn't see. Every plate she set down went into it, every sack she filled, every stranger she got up out of the dirt of her own yard and put to bed by her own stove. It wasn't a ledger of coin. It was a ledger of grace, and it had been filling for 26 years, page after page, meal after meal, and Odessa Vance was the only person in the whole Panhandle who didn't know it existed. She thought she was just keeping a promise. She thought her kindness was the most ordinary thing in the world, worth exactly nothing, owed nothing back. She was wrong about that. She was about to find out how wrong. Because far to the north, up where the trail crossed the Cimarron and the great herds fanned out toward the railheads, the young drifter she'd fed on the first night of this story was sitting at a chuckwagon fire, telling what he'd seen. His name was Tom Early, though nobody at that fire had asked it, same as Odessa hadn't asked it. He'd found work as a horse wrangler with a big outfit pushing 3,000 head north, and he'd earned his place, and now he sat among hard men in the firelight with a plate on his knee, and he was telling them about a woman at a crossing down south who'd fed him for free when he had nothing, and taken nothing, and hadn't even asked his name. He told it the way a man tells the thing that saved him. He told about the plate set down full, and the coffee poured out, and the crooked words carved over the door. And he told, because it had lit a slow fury in him he couldn't put out, about the banker's man, and the hammer, and the notice, and how the whole thing was 13 days now from a public sale, and how the town called her a soft-headed fool for feeding tramps while the bank ate her alive. Across the fire, a big man had gone very still. He was an older man, broad through the shoulders, with gray coming into his beard and a weathered squint from 30 years of looking at horizons. His hands were folded around a tin cup that had stopped halfway to his mouth. The other men at the fire knew who he was, and they'd have hushed for him if they'd noticed him listening, because he was the biggest cattle king on the whole Western Trail, a man who counted his herds in the tens of thousands and his men in the hundreds, and whose name opened doors from San Antonio to Dodge City. But nobody was watching him. They were watching Tom Early tell his story. The cattle king set his cup down slow in the dirt. His face, in the firelight, had gone through something. It had gone back, years and years back, to a time before the herds and the land and the name, to a time when he'd been nothing but a broke, fevered cowhand dying by a river a long way south. "What did you say?" he said. His voice was low, and it cut clean through the fire talk, and every man there went quiet at the sound of it. "What did you say the crossing was called?" "The Woman's Crossing." Tom Early looked up, surprised. "Coldwater, sir," he said. "Coldwater Crossing. The widow's name is Vance, Odessa Vance." For a long moment the big man said nothing at all. The fire popped. Somewhere out in the dark, a horse stamped and blew. And then Gideon Roark rose up off the ground to his full height, and the firelight climbed his face, and he said one thing, quiet, more to himself than to any man there. "Vance," he said. "I've been carrying that name 20 years and never knew where to lay it down." Then he turned to the man beside him, his trail boss, and he began to talk low and fast, and men started getting to their feet all around that fire, and one of them was already moving toward the picketed horses in the dark. But down at Coldwater Crossing, Odessa Vance knew nothing of any of that. She was scrubbing out the blue enamel pot in the last of the evening light, getting it clean for morning, so it would be ready and warm for whoever rode in hungry next. She had 12 days left. She thought she was alone. She thought nobody was coming. She had no idea what was already riding down the Western Trail to find her. The night the family came, Odessa had 4 coins left in the tobacco tin, and a plan she hated. She meant to ride into town come morning. She meant to lay those coins on Silas Thorne's desk and beg him for more time. $30 was not $615. She knew that, but she thought a man might see $30 set down honest and give a widow another month to find the rest. It was a poor plan. It was the only one she had. Then she heard the wagon. It came down off the North Rise slow, one wheel screaming for grease, and she knew that sound. She had heard it 40 times that summer. A wagon that hurt. A wagon that had come too far on too little. She stood in her door under Amos's carved plank and watched it roll into her yard in the last blue light. A woman drove it. Thin through the face, hands wrapped in rag against the lines. 3 children behind her in the wagon bed, packed down under a quilt, and not one of them made a sound. Children that quiet are children that have learned there is nothing to be got by crying. The woman pulled up. She looked at the sod house and the stove smoke, and she did not ask for anything. She had gone past asking. "My husband died south of the Canadian," she said. "Snakebite, 9 days back. I've got no flour and a cracked axle, and I don't rightly know where I'm going." Odessa did not think about the 4 coins. That is the truth of her, and it is the whole of her, and it is why this story gets told at all. She did not stand there and weigh her own ruin against a stranger's hunger. The rule over her door had already answered before the woman finished talking. "Get down," Odessa said. "Bring the little ones to the fire." She fed them that night on what she had. When what she had ran thin, she did the thing that sealed her. She took the tobacco tin out from under the loose floorboard by the stove, and she carried those last coins 4 miles in the dark to the Galt store. And she woke Mr. Galt by pounding on his glass, and she bought flour and salt pork with the money meant for the note. Prudence Galt stood at the top of the stairs in her nightdress and watched it happen. "You'll bury yourself," she said. "You know that. Feeding the whole trail while the bank sharpens its knife." "Maybe," Odessa said, and she counted the coins onto the counter. "But not tonight. Tonight they eat." She walked the 4 miles back with the flour on her shoulder. She cooked till the sun came up. And when the family rolled out the next morning, mended and fed, the mother tried to say a thing and could not, and Odessa waved it off the way she waved off everything. "Go on now," she said. "You've got children to raise." Then, the wagon was gone over the south rise, and Odessa Vance stood alone in her yard with an empty tin and a note she could not pay a nickel against. She had passed the last place a person could turn back from. She had spent her ransom on strangers. And she felt, God help her, lighter for it. She did not know she was not alone. She could not have known, because 400 miles north the trail was already moving. Word does not travel on the plains the way it travels in a town. In a town it goes door to door. On the trail it goes fire to fire, herd to herd, a man riding drag telling a man riding point, a cook telling a wrangler, and by the time it has crossed 3 outfits, it is no longer a story. It is a debt with a location. Tom Early had told it plain at the Cimarron. He had told it because it was the finest thing he owned, the memory of a full plate handed down to a nobody who could not pay. And Gideon Roark had risen up off the ground at the sound of the name Vance, and Gideon Roark had said a thing, and then Gideon Roark had done what men who count cattle in the tens of thousands are able to do. He had sent riders, not a posse, not a mob. Riders, going quiet from fire to fire down the whole length of the Western Trail, carrying one question and one name. Coldwater Crossing. The widow Vance. Did you ever eat at her table? And the answers came back like a tide coming in. A trail boss on the Canadian remembered 3 plates the winter of '74, and himself with no coin to lay down, and a woman who took his hand instead of his money. A black cook run off from every store in Tascosa remembered a widow who provisioned his whole wagon and sat him at her own table and dared the town to say a word. A man with a Comanche scar down half his face, a man no store would seat and no saloon would serve, remembered the one door on the plains that opened to him. A drover left behind sick by his own outfit remembered soup ladled into a tin cup while a hammer rang on a door somewhere behind him. A marshal, years back, before he had the badge, remembered being a hungry boy fed without a question asked. Every man had thought his meal was a small thing, a private thing, a kindness he had pocketed and carried and never spoken of, because a man does not go around telling how he was once too broke to buy his own dinner. Now the small things were finding each other on the trail. And they were adding up. None of it reached Coldwater Crossing. That is the cruelty of the middle of this story, and it is also the whole engine of it. Odessa knew nothing. She had 12 days, and then she had 10, and then she had 6, and she spent them the way she spent everything, quietly, and for other people. She mended the long plank table Amos had built, the one sanded smooth by 20 years of elbows. She got down on her knees and tightened every leg, though she knew the table would not be hers much longer. She could not help it. It was Amos's table. She would leave it right. She scrubbed the blue enamel pot, the chipped one sealed at the crack with flour paste, until it shone dull in the stove light. She kept it warm. Every morning she kept it warm, for whoever rode in, because 6 days left or 1 day left, the rule over the door did not change with the calendar. And in town, in a back room she never saw, Silas Thorne dipped a pen and signed his name to a paper that told the truth of the whole matter. It was not a foreclosure paper. It was a pre-contract with the railroad, and it promised them water. All the water a locomotive could drink, hauled from a spring that never went dry even in the deep of August. The railroad was coming south, and a railroad runs on water, and there was exactly one cold, reliable spring within 40 miles of the surveyed line. It ran behind a sod house at Coldwater Crossing. Thorne had never wanted $615. A man like Thorne does not ride out personally for $600. He had ridden out because he could not buy the spring outright without tipping his hand, and a called note was cleaner. Let the fool widow feed the trail into the poorhouse. Let the deadline take the land. Then the spring was the banks, and the water was the railroads, and Silas Thorne was a rich man twice over. He signed it in a good chair with a good pen. He blotted it careful. And he did not think about the widow at all, because a man who measures every soul in coin cannot conceive of a ledger kept in any other ink. The deadline came on a cold, bright morning with frost still silvering the yard. Odessa was up before the sun. She did the only thing she knew how to do on the worst morning of her life. She lit the stove. She fed it cottonwood and mesquite until it roared. She set the blue coffee pot on to boil, and she put out the tin cups on the long table, all in a row, ready. Because it was a trail morning like any other, and someone might ride in hungry, and she would not have it said that on her last day she let the fire go cold. She heard the first wagon at full light. It was not a trail wagon. It came up the town road from the south, heavy and slow, and behind it rode two men on good horses, and one of them wore a star. Silas Thorne rode at the head in a black coat, sitting his horse the way a man sits who owns the ground he crosses. Behind him came the deputy with the deed papers in a leather case, and behind them came the thing that stopped Odessa's heart in her chest. The eviction wagon. Empty, hired and waiting, come to haul her furniture and her life out into the yard and put her off the land while the whole county watched. And the county had come to watch. They rolled up along the road and stood in clumps at the edge of her yard, the way people gather at a hanging, half ashamed and unable to look away. Freight men. Homesteaders. The Galts in their good buggy, Prudence sitting up straight with her chin lifted, come to see the soft-headed widow lose the everything she had thrown away on tramps. Thorne stepped down off his horse. He did it slow. He was enjoying it and taking care not to show that he was enjoying it, which is its own kind of showing. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "The note is due today. $615, in full. I take it you are not prepared to pay it." Odessa stood in her door under the carved plank. She had flour on her apron. Her hands were red from the wash water. She did not apologize for being poor, and she did not beg. She had spent the last of her begging money on a widow with 3 children, and she found, standing there, that she was not sorry. "No," she said. "I can't pay it." "Then you understand what must happen." Thorne turned to the deputy and lifted one gloved hand toward the sod house, toward the door, toward the whole of her 26 years. "Clear it out." The deputy climbed down. Prudence Galt said it then, loud, so it carried across the frost-bright yard to every ear that had come to hear exactly this. "Soft-headed to the last," she said. "Fed the trail and starved herself. There's your Christian charity." And Odessa did the thing that no one in that yard expected, and that not one of them ever forgot. She turned around, and she went back into her house, and she picked up the blue enamel coffee pot off the stove, and she came back out and she set it on the long plank table in the cold morning air. Steam rose off it straight up. Then she began to set out the cups, one at each place, calm as a woman on an ordinary day, because if this was the last morning the table would ever be hers, then by God the table would be ready for whoever rode in hungry. Even now. Especially now. "You can take the land," she said. "Not to Thorne, not to anyone, just out into the cold. The coffee's still on." The deputy stopped with his hand on her doorframe. Even he could not quite do it, with her standing there pouring coffee for the dead. And that is the moment the north went dark with dust. Somebody's horse smelled it first and threw its head, then a freight man turned, and then the whole yard turned, and every face lifted to the north rise where the trail came down off the high plains. There was dust on the horizon, a wall of it. At first they thought it was cattle, a herd loose, maybe, or a stampede, the ground already trembling faint under their boots. But there were no cattle. There were riders. The dust broke, and under it came horses and men. 10 of them, then 40, then more than a body could count in one glance, coming down the western trail at a canter in a long, ragged line that filled the whole northern sky, hats low, coats flapping, and the sound of them rolled ahead of them like weather. 100 men and better, riding down onto Coldwater Crossing. They came off the rise and slowed and spread out and filled Odessa's yard and her road and the whole flat around her house, and the townsfolk fell back before them without knowing they were doing it. And at the front of that host rode 2 men. One was young and lean, and Odessa knew his face, though she had seen it only one night. One winter ago. Tom Early, the starving drifter, sitting a good horse now with his back straight, and beside him rode a mountain of a man on a blood bay, gray at the temples, weathered as saddle leather, with eyes that had gone soft the way hard men's eyes go soft only once or twice in a life. He rode straight to her table, and he stopped, and he sat there looking down at the blue coffee pot steaming in the cold, as if it were the most familiar thing in all the world. Gideon Roark got down off his horse. The ground seemed to take his weight and be glad of it. He took off his hat. And this cattle king, this man whose name opened doors from San Antonio to Dodge City, walked up to a widow's plank table in a frost-killed yard, and he set his hat down on it, brim up, like a man setting down a burden he has carried a very long way. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, and it shook, just at the edge, just enough. "You won't remember me. I was dying when you found me. 3 nights, 20 years back, down on the red. Fever had me, and my own outfit had left me for a dead man. You put me in your wagon and you fed me broth off a spoon, and you kept a coffee pot warm by my head for 3 nights. He looked at the blue pot. "That pot. I've seen that pot in my sleep for 20 years. Odessa stared at him. Her mouth moved. "The cowhand," she said. "The young one with the fever. You lived. I lived." Roark's jaw worked. "I built a life the size of Texas, ma'am, off 3 nights you gave a stranger for free. And I have been trying for 20 years to find where to lay the bill down." He turned to the yard full of men, and he raised his voice so it carried to Thorne, to the Galts, to every soul come to watch a widow ruined. "So today, we come to pay it." Then Gideon Roark reached into his coat and brought out a heavy poke of coin, and he did not hand it to Odessa. He set it on the table beside his hat, and he said, "But not as charity. This woman never gave a plate as charity in her life, and I'll not insult her with it now. We come to pay the fair price of what we ate. Every man his own bill." He looked at the marshal riding in at the edge of the crowd, a graying man with a star. "And we'll do it lawful, Cade, so no bank in Texas can call it a mob, and no clerk can call it a gift." Marshal Cade Bly rode forward through the parting crowd and stepped down. "I ate here too, Gideon," he said quietly. "Before the star, I was a hungry boy, and she never asked my name." He set his own coin on the table. "Count it fair, and I'll witness every dollar onto that deed myself, right in front of the deputy. Clean and legal." And then the line formed. It formed without a word of order given. 100 rough men on the plains of Texas got down off their horses and made a line across a widow's yard, and one by one they came to the table, and one by one they laid down coin, and each man named his meal as he paid. A trail boss came first, big hands turning his hat. 3 plates, ma'am, the winter of '74. I was busted flat, and you fed me and my 2 drovers, and took my hand instead of my money when I had none. I've owed you 5 years. He laid down a gold piece worth 10 of the plates. "Interest," he said, and stepped aside. A man with a scar down half his face came next. A Comanche scar, the face no store would serve, and no saloon would seat. He did not say much. He was not a man who said much. "No door on this trail ever opened to me but yours," he said. "You seated me at your own table and dared the town to speak." He set down his coin. "There's men would kill for that and never know it. I only got money." And he touched his hat and went. The black trail cook came, the one run off from every counter in Tascosa. "You provisioned my whole wagon when 3 towns turned me out at the door," he said. "Sat me down like a man. I've cooked for 1,000 mouths since, and I never once forgot the one that fed me first." His coin rang down on the pile. A drover came, thin and pale, still weak in the legs. "Soup in a tin cup," he said, "while a hammer was ringing on your door. My own outfit left me sick in your yard, and you knelt in the dirt and fed me anyhow. I heard that hammer, ma'am. I know what it cost you, and I know you fed me while it fell." He could barely get it out. He set his coin down and turned away with his hand over his eyes. They kept coming. Every man his own bill, every bill a small true thing paid 10 times over, and the pile on the plank table grew, coin on coin on coin, gold and silver heaped up in the frost-bright morning, until it caught the low sun and threw light back up into 100 weathered faces. Odessa Vance stood there with both hands over her mouth and wept without a sound. She had not known. That is the thing that broke her, and it is the thing that makes the story true. She had truly not known. She had thought every plate was ordinary. She had thought her kindness owed her nothing and would come to nothing, because that is what the town had told her every day for years, soft in the head, feeding tramps with the bank's money. She had believed the ledger she'd kept was invisible, was foolish, was worth nothing at all. And here it was. Here it stood in her yard, 100 men tall, counting itself out on Amos's table in the cold. Silas Thorne stood by his black horse with the deed papers going soft in his hand. He watched the coin pile up, and he did the arithmetic, because arithmetic was the only language he had. 615. The pile passed it before the line was a third done. It passed it twice. It passed it 3 times, and the men kept coming. "This is irregular," Thorne said. His voice had gone thin. "The note is due to the bank." "There are procedures, the note," said Marshal Bly, and he had the deed papers in his hand now, and the deputy beside him nodding is going to be paid in full, in lawful coin, counted and witnessed, today, before the deadline you set yourself. Is that not what the paper requires, Mr. Thorne? Payment in full by this date? He counted $615 off the top of the pile, slow onto the deed itself, coin by coin, while the deputy watched and marked each one. "There's your money, sir, every cent." The deputy will stamp the note clear. The deputy took out his stamp. He looked at Thorne. Thorne had no card left to play. The deputy pressed the stamp down on the note. Paid, clear, done. It rang out flat in the cold, and the whole yard heard it. And then Gideon Roark walked over to Silas Thorne, and he stood very close, and he said the thing quiet, so that only the front rows heard it, and the rest read it off the town's faces afterward for years. "You rode out to collect $600, Roark said. "We rode out to settle a debt your ledgers never had a line for." Thorne's mouth opened. Nothing came. But it was not over for Silas Thorne. It was not over, because Tom Early stepped up out of the line then, and he was holding something, and he had been waiting all morning to hold it up. "I seen your men upriver, mister," Tom Early said, loud enough now for the whole yard. 2 weeks back, riding down the trail, I seen surveyor stakes driven along the widow's spring, and I found this in the grass where one of them dropped it. He held up a folded paper. "Give it here, Mr. Roark. You read better than me. Read what the bank president was really after." Roark took it. He opened it. He read it once to himself, and his face changed, and then he read it out loud to the yard, in a voice that carried to the last man at the back. It was the railroad water pre-contract, signed, Silas Thorne's own hand, promising the railroad every drop of the spring that never went dry, the spring behind Odessa's house, for a sum that made the $615 look like the $4 she'd started with. The yard went quiet. Then it went dangerous. "He never wanted your note, ma'am," Roark said. "He wanted your water. He called the note so the land would fall to the bank, and the water with it, and he'd have sold your spring to the railroad for a fortune and let the whole county believe you'd ruined yourself with charity. He folded the paper. He looked at Thorne with something worse than anger. He looked at him the way a man looks at something small. You didn't come to collect a debt. You came to steal a spring off a widow and dress it up in a foreclosure, in front of these same folks who called her a fool for feeding their trail. Nobody laid a hand on Silas Thorne. That is the mercy and the justice of it both. No man had to. His own paper had done it, read out loud in a widow's yard before every face in the county, the same faces that had watched him nail her ruin to her door. He had measured every soul in coin, and coin was the one thing that could not answer for him now, because the debt in that yard was not written in any ink he owned. He got up on his black horse with the whole county watching him do it, and he rode back toward town alone. And the eviction wagon he'd hired sat empty in the road, and not one soul moved to help him, and the waterland stayed hers. And Prudence Galt, who had said soft-headed on the store porch while the hammer fell, who had said soft-headed to the last not an hour before with her chin in the air, Prudence Galt stood at the edge of that yard and watched 100 men take off their hats to the widow she had mocked. She watched the cattle king bow his gray head. She watched the marshal witness the coin. She watched the whole trail she'd sneered at stand-up and honor the woman she'd refused credit at her own counter. She did not get shouted down. Nobody wasted a word on her. That was worse. She had to stand there in the cold and witness the reverence, silent, with no place to put her face, and know that every soul present had seen exactly how wrong she'd been and would remember it as long as they lived. Her comeuppance was the honoring itself, and she had to watch every minute of it. When the coin was counted and the note was clear, and Thorne was a speck on the town road, the men did not ride out. Roark looked at the sod house, low and old, with its one door and its carved plank. He looked at the long table sitting out in the frost that fed the whole trail. And he said, "This won't do. A table that's fed 100 men shouldn't sit under a roof this size." He did not ask her. That is the purity proof of the whole thing, and the premise of her whole life turned back on her at last. She had never asked. Now 100 men did not ask either. They took off their coats. Cattle kings and drovers and a marshal and a scar-faced scout and a black trail cook and a boy named Tom Early, and they raised her a wider porch and a real roof in a single afternoon, hammering in the cold. And by dusk Amos's carved plank hung over a doorway twice the size, and the blue coffee pots steamed on the same black stove, and the long table Amos built stood under a roof worthy of it, at last. Odessa Vance walked among them with the pot, filling cups, taking nothing, the way she had done every day of her life, and every man there let her, because they understood by now that letting her pour was the only gift she would ever take. The frost came early that year, and by the time it silvered the whole Panhandle white, the wayside at Coldwater Crossing was a known stop on the length of the Western Trail. Men planned their drives around it. Amos's old carved rule still hung over the door: no man rides hungry from this door, and beside it, now, hung a new plank the drovers had burned the letters into themselves, on a night with a fire and a bottle and a lot of laughing. It read, "The widow's table. No man rides hungry." The blue enamel coffee pot steamed on the same black stove, chip and crack and flour paste seal and all. She would not have a new one. Roark had offered to buy her the finest copper pot in Kansas City. And she had laughed at him. Tom Early stayed on. The drifter who had once stood hat in hand at her door, too broke to buy a meal, worked her yard now and mended her wagons and slept in the new bunkroom the men had raised, and called her nothing but ma'am, and would have died before he let her carry a full bucket while he had 2 hands. Word drifted down the trail that winter, the way word does, fire to fire. The Drovers Trust Bank had lost the railroad contract when the spring stayed in the widow's name. Silas Thorne's Coldwater office closed its door and did not open again. Nobody at the crossing spoke much of him. There was nothing to say. His ledgers had been full, and his debt had come due anyway, and no coin he owned could pay it. One evening near dark, with the frost coming down, and the light gone gold and low over the flat, a stranger rode in off the north rise. Young, thin through the face, hungry the way the trail makes a man hungry, with that look of a fellow who has counted his last coins and come up short. He got down slow and stood at the edge of the light, hat in his hand, and started to say a thing about how he hadn't the money just now, but he could work. He could split wood. He could. Odessa Vance came out under the 2 carved planks with a full plate in her hands. She set it down on the long table in front of him. She poured him coffee out of the cracked blue pot. And she took nothing, and she asked him nothing, not even his name. "Sit down and eat," she said. "You can tell me your troubles, or you can keep them. Either way, the plate's the same." The boy sat down. Behind him the stove glowed, and the pot steamed, and Tom Early crossed the yard to see to his horse without being asked. And the pattern went on unbroken, the way it had gone on before any of them ever rode in, the way it would go on after. Because here is the thing the bank never understood, and the town learned too late, and Odessa Vance never quite believed, even after 100 men proved it in her own yard on a frostbright morning. Some debts are never written down. There's no note for them, no ledger, no clerk to stamp them clear. A woman gives a plate to a stranger and thinks it's nothing and forgets it by supper. But it doesn't die. It rides north with the man who ate it. It waits at 1,000 fires, and it comes back, when it's needed most and least expected, 100 strong over the northern rise. Those are the only debts that ever really get paid. If this story rode with you, tell me in the comments the city you're watching from. I'd like to know how far the widow's table has traveled by now.